On the morning of January 24, 1965, a doctor stepped out of a terraced house in London and handed a short statement to a waiting press officer. It contained 11 words. Within the hour, those 11 words were being read aloud on radio stations across the world. What had happened inside that house during the previous 24 hours, and the weeks before them, was not simply the death of an old man. It was the closing of an era that an entire generation had lived through and survived only because of the man now gone. There is a detail at the center of Winston Churchill's death that stops most people when they hear it for the first time. In 1953, while shaving one morning at Downing Street, Churchill turned to his private secretary John Colville and remarked that the date was January 24th, the same day his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had died in 1895. He told Colville with quiet certainty that it was also the day he himself would die. He repeated this to his son-in-law Christopher Soames shortly after his 90th birthday in November 1964. Colville, who knew Churchill well enough to take the prediction seriously, later told the Queen's private secretary plainly that Churchill would not die until January 24th. The date was noted and the waiting began. It is the kind of detail that sounds like invention, the sort of neat coincidence that gets added to a biography after the fact to give events a sense of shape they did not have in the moment. But it is attested by multiple witnesses, set down in contemporaneous accounts. Churchill did die on January 24th, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father. The full biblical span of a lifetime, 70 years and 10, had elapsed between the two deaths in the same family, on the same date. Whether Churchill had simply reached a private accommodation with his own mortality, or whether something stranger was at work, is not a question that admits a clean answer. What is clear is that, in the final weeks of his life, those closest to him understood that the end was coming and that Churchill himself had known, or believed he knew, when it would arrive. To understand those final 24 hours, you first need to understand the state of the man who lay in the bedroom at 28 Hyde Park Gate, because what had happened to Churchill's body in the years before January 1965 is a story of extraordinary endurance and of a slow, grinding decline that makes what he managed to remain, even at the end, all the more striking. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Marlborough, into whose family he was born on his father's side. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was American, the daughter of a New York financier. The combination of those two bloodlines, English aristocracy and American energy, was something Churchill himself referenced throughout his life. By any measure, the life he lived between 1874 and 1965 was not a single life. It contained the careers of half a dozen men. He had served as a cavalry officer and participated in one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history, at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. He had worked as a war correspondent in South Africa during the Boer War, been taken prisoner, escaped from a detention camp, and emerged as a public figure of genuine celebrity before he had turned 26. He had entered Parliament in 1900 and spent 62 of the following 64 years as a member of Parliament, a span of service with almost no parallel in modern democratic history. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War and bore responsibility for the disastrous Dardanelles campaign of 1915, the attempt to force a naval passage through the straits that guard the approach to Constantinople, and the subsequent land assault at Gallipoli, which cost enormous losses among British, Australian, New Zealand, and other Allied troops without achieving its objective. The failure destroyed his political reputation for a generation. He resigned from the cabinet, volunteered for active service on the Western Front, and commanded an infantry battalion in the trenches. He returned to government in 1917, eventually serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Stanley Baldwin in the 1920s, before entering what became known as his wilderness years, the decade of the 1930s when he was out of office, largely dismissed by the political establishment, and spending his time at his country estate at Chartwell, writing, painting, and issuing warnings about the rise of Adolf Hitler that almost no one with power chose to hear. He became Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940, the same day Germany launched its offensive into the Low Countries. He was 65 years old. What he accomplished in the 5 years that followed has been documented analyzed, and argued over by historians ever since. The broad lines are beyond serious dispute. He held Britain together at the moment of its greatest danger, forged and maintained the alliance that eventually defeated Nazi Germany, and gave his countrymen a sense of purpose and resolution at a time when both were desperately needed. He left office in the election of July 1945, voted out by a British public that admired him as a war leader but wanted the Labour Party's social reforms after years of sacrifice. He returned as Prime Minister in 1951, serving a second term until 1955, when declining health finally forced his resignation. He had suffered his first stroke in August 1949 while on holiday near Monte Carlo. A second, far more severe stroke struck him in June 1953 at a dinner at Downing Street. He was left partially paralyzed on one side, barely able to walk, with slurred speech. His doctors and his inner circle kept it secret from the public and from most of his cabinet colleagues for weeks. The reason the date of January 24th came to mean something to those around him in 1953 was precisely this. A man who had suffered a stroke of that severity at the age of 78, and who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, had made what amounted to a calm private prediction about the date of his own death. By the end of 1964, Churchill had suffered a total of 8 strokes since 1949. Each had taken something from him. His memory was unreliable. His mobility had deteriorated to the point where he was largely confined to his home at 28 Hyde Park Gate, a Georgian townhouse in the Kensington district of London. He had resigned from Parliament in July 1964, the last act of a parliamentary career stretching back 64 years. His eyesight had weakened. The cigars that had been his defining personal emblem were now restricted by his doctors to a small number per day and were sometimes left unlit, held for comfort rather than smoked. He spent much of his time sitting in a chair, looking out of windows, or being read to when his eyes were too strained for books. He had turned 90 on November 30th, 1964. A crowd gathered outside Hyde Park Gate to sing to him. He appeared briefly at the window, pale and slow, and waved. It was his last public appearance. The man who appeared at that window in November was already living on borrowed time in the most literal sense. What happened to him in the first weeks of January 1965 and how the people around him responded brings us to the beginning of the final chapter. On January 10, 1965, Churchill suffered his 9th and final stroke. It was a severe cerebral thrombosis, a clot blocking blood supply to the brain, and unlike his previous strokes, from which he had recovered to varying degrees, this one produced no recovery. He lapsed into a state of deep unconsciousness almost immediately. His physician, Lord Moran, Charles Wilson, the man who had served as Churchill's personal doctor since May 1940, 25 years earlier, came to Hyde Park Gate and assessed the damage. He found his patient unresponsive, breathing with effort, the body sustaining itself, while the consciousness within it had retreated to somewhere beyond reach. Moran issued the first of what would become a series of 19 public medical bulletins over the following 2 weeks. The bulletins were deliberately measured in their language, giving the public enough information to understand that Churchill's condition was grave without specifying the precise extent of the damage. Britain was, in an understated way, preparing itself. Crowds began gathering outside Hyde Park Gate within days of the first bulletin. They stood in the cold and the winter drizzle, speaking quietly among themselves, looking up at the windows of the house, not leaving. The medical question Moran faced was a stark one. Churchill was 90 years old. He had a history of extensive cardiovascular disease and 8 previous strokes. The damage from this 9th stroke was, in Moran's clinical assessment and that of the neurologist consulted alongside him, catastrophic and irreversible. There was no meaningful intervention available. Churchill's great age made hospitalization inadvisable. Moving him carried its own risks, and there was no treatment available in a hospital that could not be provided at home. So he remained in his bedroom on the upper floor of 28 Hyde Park Gate, tended by nurses around the clock, sustained by small sips of orange juice when he could swallow, his family gathering around him in shifts as the days passed. Lady Churchill, Clementine, his wife of 56 years, was at the house throughout. Their surviving children came: Randolph, his son, who was himself seriously ill; Sarah, one of his daughters; Anne Mary, the youngest and perhaps the closest to her father in temperament and disposition; who was married to Christopher Soames, now a senior conservative politician. Grandchildren passed through the house. Anthony Montague Brown, Churchill's devoted private secretary who had served him since 1952, was present through much of those final weeks, managing the household's dealings with the outside world with the same careful loyalty that had characterized his decade of service. Churchill never regained full consciousness after the stroke of January 10th. There were moments, according to those at his bedside, when something flickered, a response to a voice, a movement of the hand, but nothing that constituted recovery. His body, with extraordinary stubbornness, maintained its functions. The heart kept beating. The lungs kept working. For 14 days, he defied the predictions of those who had expected the end within hours of the stroke occurring. The country waiting outside that house was not simply watching the death of a famous man. Britain in January 1965 was watching something more complex than that. The passing of the last direct human connection to a world that had defined the entire first half of the 20th century. And the government that had been planning for this moment since 1953 was now quietly activating a plan that had been revised and updated for 12 years. When Churchill suffered his major stroke in June 1953, Queen Elizabeth II, who had been on the throne for barely a year, made a decision that was, in the context of British royal history, almost unprecedented. She instructed the Duke of Norfolk, who in his role as Earl Marshal of England was responsible for the organization of state funerals, to begin planning a state funeral for Winston Churchill. The directive was that the funeral should be arranged on a scale befitting his position in history. The code name assigned to the plan was Operation Hope Not, a name chosen, according to those involved, to reflect the wish that the plan would not need to be used anytime soon. Churchill was 68 years old in 1953, and had just survived a stroke that his doctors had privately assessed as very nearly fatal. Planning began. Over the following 12 years, as Churchill continued to survive, outliving the original planner's expectations, outliving multiple revisions of the document, and, as Lord Mountbatten later put it, with characteristic dry humor, outliving several of the designated pallbearers, Operation Hope Not was refined, expanded, and updated continuously. The final document, completed in November 1964, just 2 months before Churchill's death, ran to approximately 200 pages. Every element of the proceedings was timed to the second. The route of the funeral procession was mapped to pass through locations relevant to Churchill's life. The music to be played was specified. The positioning of the military units was choreographed. The type of gun carriage to bear the coffin, the vessel to carry it along the Thames, the train to transport it to Oxfordshire, all of it had been determined, rehearsed, and prepared. The plan had required modification on at least one occasion before 1965, when it was partly activated in June 1962, after Churchill fell and broke his hip at a hotel in Monte Carlo. Those around him feared at the time that the injury was worse than it was. Churchill, conscious and alarmed by his own condition, had told his private secretary Montague Brown that he wanted to die in England and made him promise to ensure it. The RAF flew Churchill back to London against the advice of French doctors who considered him too fragile to be moved. He spent 55 days at the Middlesex Hospital recovering, and Operation Hope Not returned to its filing cabinet. In January 1965, it was retrieved for the last time. The plan was issued in its final form on January 26th, 2 days after Churchill's death. But on the evening of January 23rd, 1965, none of this machinery had yet been set in motion. Inside the bedroom at Hyde Park Gate, something that had lasted for 90 years was approaching its final hours, and the people gathered in that house were watching it happen. By the evening of Saturday, January 23, 1965, the medical team attending Churchill had observed a significant acceleration of deterioration. His breathing had become shallower. His pulse was weakening. Lord Moran, who had maintained a steady professional composure through 14 days of bulletins and bedside visits, arrived at Hyde Park Gate in the late afternoon. He examined Churchill and understood that what he was seeing was the final stage. The family was assembled. Clementine Churchill, who had spent nearly all of the preceding fortnight at her husband's side, was present. Randolph Churchill, Churchill's son, whose own health was gravely compromised, he was suffering from serious lung disease that would itself prove fatal within 2 years, was in the house. Mary Soames was there. Christopher Soames, the son-in-law to whom Churchill had made his prediction about January 24th just weeks earlier, was also present. It was Christopher Soames to whom Churchill had spoken what became accepted as his final coherent words. Earlier in his final illness, before the last stroke, Churchill had told Soames that it had been a grand journey and that it had been well worth making. He then paused and added the single word once. The remark was recorded and passed on. It captured something of the man with great economy, the acknowledgement that the life had been remarkable, alongside the private knowledge of what a remarkable life had actually cost. The house at Hyde Park Gate was quiet in the way that houses become quiet around the seriously ill. Sounds muffled, voices dropped, the ordinary business of the world suspended by the awareness of something much larger happening in one room upstairs. Nurses moved between the bedroom and the corridor. Family members sat and waited. Outside, in the January cold, the small crowd that had maintained its vigil for days stood in the darkness. Some had brought flowers, some held small candles. Most stood in silence. Moran had, by his own account, expected Churchill's death before midnight. He was wrong. The man who had predicted January 24th persisted through the night of the 23rd, with the same stubborn physical endurance that had characterized his entire existence. His heart, which had carried him through the Sudan, the Boer War, the trenches of France, the Blitz, the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam, the indignity of electoral defeat, and the vindication of his second premiership, kept beating through the night. The date Churchill had predicted for more than a decade arrived while he was still alive. What happened during the morning hours of January 24th, and the final moments inside that bedroom, was witnessed by those closest to him, and their accounts have been preserved. Sunday, January 24th, 1965. The house at Hyde Park Gate had been still through the night. Churchill's breathing continued, slow and shallow. The nurses maintained their watch. Family members, exhausted from the days of waiting, moved in and out of the bedroom. Lord Moran arrived at the house at 7:18 in the morning. He went directly upstairs. At some point shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, Winston Churchill's heart stopped. He had been unconscious and at rest. There was no dramatic moment of the kind that fiction invents for the deaths of great men. No final speech, no last gesture, no theatrical summation. He was in his bed, in his house, surrounded by the people who had loved him, and he simply stopped breathing. He was 90 years old. The death announcement was given to the Press Association at 8:35 in the morning. Lord Moran had first informed Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Harold Wilson before the public statement was released. The announcement itself was brief, 11 words identifying the time of death and the location. Moran signed it in his capacity as Churchill's physician. Within minutes of the announcement reaching the BBC, the broadcaster interrupted its scheduled programming and began playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The opening 4 notes of that symphony, 3 short and 1 long, formed the Morse code signal for the letter V, and the BBC had used it throughout the Second World War as the opening of its broadcasts to occupied Europe. The choice was not accidental. It connected Churchill's death directly to the moment he had defined, the years between 1940 and 1945, when his voice, carried on those same airwaves, had told a beleaguered continent that resistance was not only possible, but necessary. The news moved through London and then through Britain, with the speed that major news always travels, faster than ordinary information, carried by something that feels closer to instinct than communication. People stopped on the street when they heard it. Shops fell quiet. In homes across the country, families gathered around radios and, increasingly by 1965, around television sets. Prime Minister Harold Wilson issued a statement describing Churchill as the greatest of all living Englishmen. Messages arrived from heads of state across the world, from Lyndon Johnson in Washington, from Charles de Gaulle in Paris, from Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in Moscow, from leaders of nations that had been enemies in Churchill's lifetime and were now aligned with Britain. Outside 28 Hyde Park Gate, those who had stood through the night now stood in the gray January morning with a different quality of stillness. The vigil that had been an act of hope was now an act of mourning. Flowers accumulated at the iron railings of the house. People who had no personal connection to Churchill, who had never met him, never been in the same room with him, stood there because being somewhere near the place where he had died seemed necessary. The announcement of Churchill's death set in motion a sequence of events that had been planned in precise detail for 12 years. But the scale of what actually happened, the number of people who came, the reactions that emerged, exceeded even the most careful planning. And one specific moment during the funeral proceedings became the image by which the event was remembered above all others. The formal response to Churchill's death was organized with the meticulous precision that Operation Hope Not had prepared. His body lay in state at Westminster Hall, the great medieval chamber adjacent to the Houses of Parliament, where Churchill had spent 62 years as a member, from January 26th for 3 days. The queue to file past the coffin stretched at its longest for several miles, at points extending across Westminster Bridge and along the south bank of the Thames. The waiting time was reported at various points as exceeding 4 hours. An estimated 320,000 people passed through Westminster Hall during those 3 days. They came from across Britain and from countries that had no direct connection to Churchill's wartime role but understood his place in 20th century history. The state funeral itself took place on Saturday, January 30th, 1965. It was the first state funeral in the United Kingdom for a non-member of the royal family since 1935. The only comparable precedent from the previous century was the funeral of the Duke of Wellington in 1852. Representatives of 112 nations attended. Former Prime Ministers Clement Attlee, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and Alec Douglas Home were among the mourners. De Gaulle attended in person. Dwight Eisenhower, who had served alongside Churchill as the supreme Allied commander in Europe, came from the United States. The flags of the United States were flown at half-staff for the duration of the funeral, the first time in American history that this honor had been extended for a foreign leader. 9 military bands participated in the procession. A 90-gun salute was fired in Hyde Park, 1 round for each year of Churchill's life. The coffin was carried on a gun carriage drawn by 98 sailors of the Royal Navy through the streets of London to St. Paul's Cathedral, where the funeral service was held. The cathedral's great bells, which had rung to mark Allied victories during the Second World War, tolled as the procession arrived. Inside the cathedral, bugle calls sounded from high in the dome. The last post played first, then, after a pause, Réveillé, the military call that marks a new beginning rather than an ending. From St. Paul's, Churchill's coffin was carried in a launch called M.V. Havengore along the River Thames to Waterloo Station, where a specially prepared train, pulled by a locomotive named Winston Churchill, carried the coffin and the family to Hanborough Station in Oxfordshire, 7 miles from the village of Bladon. From Hanborough, the journey was made by hearse to the churchyard of St. Martin's Church, Bladon, where Churchill was buried in a private family ceremony alongside his father, Lord Randolph, his mother, Lady Randolph, and his brother John. The moment on the Thames that day that lodged most deeply in the memory of those who watched was not part of the official plan. As M.V. Havengore carried the coffin westward along the river, the dock cranes along the south bank of the Thames, 36 of them, operated by workers from Hayes Wharf, lowered their jibs in a slow, synchronized gesture of salute as the boat passed beneath them. The tribute had been organized by the managing director of Hayes Wharf, Sir David Burnett, and had required the crane operators to come in on a Saturday, their day off. The crane operators agreed. Their great metal arms dipped one after another as the launch moved upstream, the largest machines on the river bowing before a wooden box draped in a flag. An estimated 350 million people around the world watched Churchill's funeral on television. But there is another dimension to Churchill's death, one that sits beneath the official ceremony and the world's tributes, that takes considerably longer to fully appreciate. Because the man who died at 28 Hyde Park Gate on the morning of January 24th was not simply the heroic figure of the wartime years. He was also a man who had known failure on an enormous scale, and who had spent decades in the darkness before the world needed what only he could offer. Churchill spent the 1930s at Chartwell, his country house in Kent, writing and painting and issuing warnings about Germany that almost no one who mattered chose to hear. He had been out of government since 1929. His attempt to block Indian self-government had made him look to many of his conservative colleagues like a relic of a vanished imperial worldview. His warnings about Hitler were dismissed by an establishment that had lived through the slaughter of the First World War and was profoundly committed to any policy that would prevent a repetition of it. Those years were marked by the condition he had lived with throughout his adult life, what he called his black dog. The phrase referred to episodes of low mood and profound withdrawal that had visited him periodically since at least his 20s, sometimes lasting for months. He described it in letters to his wife Clementine, noting with relief when it lifted, with resignation when it returned. During the wilderness years of the 1930s, with no great work to consume him and no meaningful position from which to act on his warnings, the black dog was a persistent companion. He had developed his remedies over decades. Painting, which he had taken up after the catastrophe of Gallipoli in 1915, gave him access to a kind of concentration that quieted the internal noise. He was a serious painter, not a gifted amateur dabbling for recreation, but someone who studied the craft, sought advice from professional artists, and produced canvases that were exhibited and collected. He also wrote. The sheer output of Churchill's literary life is staggering. Biographies, histories, memoirs, journalism, speeches. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, awarded specifically for his 6-volume history of the Second World War and for the body of his political speeches. It was and remains the only Nobel Prize in Literature awarded primarily for a body of political oratory. Bricklaying was another occupation he had discovered in the 1920s and returned to throughout his life. Physical, repetitive, requiring enough attention to block other thoughts without demanding the kind of concentration that exhausted him when his mood was low. The wall he built at Chartwell still stands. What the wilderness years eventually produced, through the combination of political exile, sustained writing, persistent public warning, and whatever private discipline held the black dog at bay long enough for the work to get done, was a man who arrived at the crisis of 1940 more completely prepared for it than any other figure in British public life. He had spent a decade studying Hitler when no one else in power would. He had maintained his own intelligence network, receiving information about German rearmament that his party's leadership was not acting upon. He had written and spoken about fascism until the argument was impossible to ignore. And when Neville Chamberlain's government fell on May 10, 1940, and the king sent for Churchill, he was ready in a way that no amount of conventional ministerial preparation could have produced. He was 65 years old. He had been in public life for 40 years. He had been written off so many times that some of those who had written him off had themselves retired, died, or been forgotten. And now the world needed exactly the thing that his particular combination of gifts, obsessions, failures, and recoveries had prepared him to provide. What Churchill provided during those years, the speeches, the decisions, the sheer force of personal will, was something that people who lived through it found almost impossible to adequately describe afterward. The closest most of them came was to say that without him, Britain would have made terms with Hitler. Whether that assessment is historically accurate has been argued ever since. But there is no argument about what those who lived through it believed at the time, and by January 1965, almost all of those people were still alive, watching the news bulletins from Hyde Park Gate. Churchill's physician Lord Moran wrote in his diary entry for January 24, 1965, the day of Churchill's death, that he had been watching the approach of this moment for a long time, had prepared himself for it, and found that none of the preparation had actually been adequate. He had known Churchill for 25 years, through strokes and pneumonias and surgeries and elections, through Yalta and Potsdam and the corridors of Downing Street. The relationship between a long-serving personal physician and his patient develops dimensions that go beyond the strictly medical. Moran understood that what had ended that morning was not replaceable. Among those who reacted publicly to the death, the range of responses was extraordinary. Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, leader of the party that had voted Churchill out of office in 1945, called him the greatest of all living Englishmen. De Gaulle, whose relationship with Churchill during the war had been one of the most difficult personal and political relationships in the Allied coalition, marked by deep friction, mutual frustration, and occasional outright contempt on both sides, paid tribute in terms that acknowledged what the two men had been to each other and to the larger struggle they had shared. Eisenhower, who had commanded the Allied forces in Europe under Churchill's sometimes maddening and always forceful oversight, issued a statement in which he described his memories of working alongside Churchill during the planning of the D-Day landings and the campaigns that followed. He noted that Churchill's insistence on being heard, on being argued with, and having arguments made back to him rather than simply being obeyed, had produced better decisions than simple deference would have. It was an unusual tribute, an acknowledgement not of Churchill's greatness in the abstract, but of his usefulness in the specific, difficult human work of waging a coalition war. Ordinary people across Britain responded with something that surprised even those who had been expecting it. The size and patience of the queues at Westminster Hall, the crowds along the funeral route on January 30th, the thousands who stood in the January cold without any particular organization or direction. These were not the product of official encouragement, but of a felt need to mark what had ended. Many of the people in those queues had been children during the war. They had grown up hearing a voice on the radio that told them the things they needed to hear at exactly the moments when they most needed to hear them. Now the voice was gone, and standing in the cold outside Westminster Hall was a way of acknowledging that. The queue that stretched for miles on the south bank of the Thames was not standing for a politician. It was not standing for a prime minister or a Nobel laureate or a military strategist. It was standing for something more specific than any of those categories, for the memory of what it had felt like as a child or a young person or an anxious adult in a city being bombed, to hear a particular voice tell you that this could be survived, that Britain would fight on, that the darkness was not permanent. There is a quality to Churchill's death that resists simple summarization. The man who had fought on Omdurman's battlefield at 23, who had escaped from a Boer War prison camp at 25, who had been stripped of his office after Gallipoli and gone to fight in the trenches rather than simply retire, who had spent the 1930s in the political wilderness without abandoning his warnings, who had become prime minister at 65, in the worst crisis his country had faced in centuries, and held the position for 5 of the most consequential years in British history. That man died quietly in his bed, on the date he had predicted, in his own house, with his family around him. Lord Colville, who had been present in 1953 when Churchill first mentioned January 24th, and who had been present through many of the most significant moments of the war years and after, spent the rest of his own life unable to account for the prediction in any satisfying, rational way. It was simply true. Churchill had said it, and it was true. In the years since 1965, Churchill's historical reputation has been revised, contested, and reassessed with the kind of attention that only the very largest figures attract. His imperialist convictions, the belief in British Empire as a force for civilization that was common among men of his class and generation, but which produced policies with severe human costs in India, in Africa, and elsewhere, have been examined in increasing detail and with decreasing tolerance. His record on specific wartime decisions, including the area bombing campaign against German cities and his response to the Bengal famine of 1943, has been debated with genuine seriousness by historians who are not engaged in simple demolition, but in the difficult work of assessing a complex person honestly. None of that complexity was absent in January 1965. It was simply held in suspension by the weight of what had just ended. The people who stood in those queues at Westminster Hall, and who lined the streets of London on January 30th, and who watched the cranes lower on the Thames, were not engaged in historical assessment. They were present at a leave-taking that felt, to those who had lived through the years it encompassed, like the closing of a door that would never open again. Churchill was buried at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, a few hundred yards from the gates of Blenheim Palace, where he had been born. The circle closed with a completeness that felt almost architectural. The village church, small and plain, and set among old English fields, was nothing like the cathedrals and monuments the world expected to mark the resting place of such a man. But it was what he had wanted, to be near his father, and his mother, and his brother, in the ground of a place that was simply home. The cranes on the Thames rose again after the boat had passed. The queues at Westminster Hall eventually ended. The crowds along the funeral route dispersed, and the world that Churchill had done so much to shape continued as worlds do without him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.